In today's episode, we're diving into the legacy of one of the UK's most prestigious children's book awards, the Carnegie Medal. But we're not just talking about who won it. We're asking, why does its history matter, and how can that history help us as editors and librarians supporting meaningful engagement with young readers today? Joining us today is Lucy Pearson, a researcher whose work uncovers the deeper stories behind the Carnegie Medal. Together, we'll explore how its evolving values reflect our society and how understanding this legacy can empower young people to think critically about the books they read and the world around them. So, welcome, Lucy. We're going to dive straight in and start with our first question. Actually, just before I do that, I just want to say is that I met you, didn't I, at Newcastle University? We were at the Northeast. Was it the Northeast Librarians conference day or something
Yes,
like
it
that?
was. Yeah.
And you did a talk. So this is why you've ended up chatting to us on our podcast today, because you were talking about the Carnegie Medal. And I just thought, you know, this is something that both Ruth and I would be really interested in hearing. So it doesn't matter if nobody else enjoys it, we're going to enjoy this one. So tell me about why you chose to focus your research on the Carnegie Medal and what drew you into its history.
So in the micro, it was a complete accident. And in the macro, it feels as if it's the thing that my whole career has been going towards. So I
Okay.
started working on it because somebody asked me to write a book chapter about children's literature in the post-war era, which was a little bit earlier than my previous work. And I thought, what peg can I hang this on? Because obviously, children's literature is a huge topic and there's loads of things you could write about. And I thought, oh, the Carnegie Medal started in 1936. That's about right. Um, so I initially wrote this book chapter about the first 20 years of the medal and kind of how they fitted into that kind of wartime, post war picture. And then realized actually there wasn't that much out there. And it seemed like a huge gap for something that's so important and has been running for so long. You know, it's been running longer than the Booker. So that's how I stumbled into it. But actually, it does feel like it's all come together because in a previous life, before I was an academic, I was a school librarian. Um, and I shadowed the Carnegie with my book group, which was an experience that I really enjoyed, but also an experience that I'm sure school librarians will know, can be quite challenging because of all the kind of vagaries of what books are on the shortlist and who the young people are who are interested in being involved. And actually, I don't think any of my Carnegie shadowers ever read a whole book on the shortlist. So it kind of came together as two strands, my kind of past life as a school librarian, and my interest in books for young people, working with young people, and then that kind of historical dimension, which is a really important part of my academic work.
It's just fascinating how sometimes life just happens, isn't it? And again, I worked as a librarian who supported schools and used to run the Carnegie Medal. And for me personally, it was an opportunity to read books that I probably wouldn't have chosen myself. And that was what really hooked me in the fact that if that's what it was doing for me, hopefully that's what it was doing even more so for the students we were working with. So it's always been a bit of a fascination for me. And I would imagine Ruth as well. Do you run Carnegie groups?
Yeah, we run Carnegie groups. Interestingly, this year is the first year that I've been there where we haven't had an active Carnegie group. And it's really to do with the shortlist this year, which I'm no doubt will come onto. But my really active book group this year was very young, and at least half the books on the shortlist were difficult books for them. And so I have a very small group of year 10 students who I opened it up to, but they just read them casually. We didn't run it as a book group. But yes, we always have done. But I really love that about the Carnegie. I know it's very controversial, but I love that there are books on there that really make people think about what children's literature is about.
Yeah.
You know, most people have never got over Melvin Burgess's Junk or The Bunker Diary or any of, you know, staff still talk about those books. Oh, that was so, you know, revolutionary.
Yeah.
So this year we haven't done it, but we usually do. Our difficulty, we have a group of students who would read all the books on the shortlist, but it's such a tight turnaround time-wise between releasing the shortlist and announcing the winner. It's tight to read all the books on the shortlist, you know, and I mean, great if they're not, and you're just accessing bits and pieces you can dip in and out, but yeah.
No, it's fascinating because each, like you say, each group every year is different.
Mm.
But going back to Lucy, going back to the Carnegie Medal, it has evolved a lot since its inception. And what does, I wonder if the evolution tells us about shifting values in children's literature. Do you think it does?
It definitely does. It also tells us a lot, I think, about the kind of shifting status of children's literature and children's librarianship. So you can really see a lot about where children's books were in the cultural picture, as it were, how much respect the profession had and how recognized it was as a distinct field. And that's changed, you know, really. The story of the Carnegie Medal is also the story of children's librarians in the UK, which is one of the things that makes it so interesting to me as a piece of historical research, is that kind of social story. So if you look right back to the first winner, obviously the first winner was Arthur Ransom's Pigeon Post, and that wasn't an unknown book at all. You know, by the time Pigeon Post is the absolute middle of the Swallows and Amazon series, it was already really well established. It was really popular. So Arthur Ransom was one of the great sellers of the age. But he had a kind of literary kudos. You know, that's a series that's completely saturated in literary history. You know, the very first book, you know, opens with a quote from Ode to Chapman's Homer. So straight away you're in a kind of world of poetry and literature, and of course it's full of adventure stories. And to me, the choice of that book from, you know, quite a strong shortlist, and the other book that could have won that year is Ballet Shoes, which has, you know, has also stood the test of time.
I read that one.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, Ballet Shoes is probably, out of the two, the book that's more still read by children now, I would say. My experience, certainly with university students, is that there are very few people who are still reading Arthur Ransom as children. But I think that it was a book that was chosen because it kind of hit this amazing sweet spot of a book that did mean a lot to children at the time, you know, that was popular, but also that was recognizably literary and kind of could show that children's books could do something that was important and complex and connected you to this kind of literary history. And it's also very situated in the kind of political modes of the time. You know, that access to the outdoor, the idea of childhood as being quite independent and quite self-sufficient, all of those kind of reflect the wider context of the age. So it was really kind of setting up the stall of the medal almost, to say, right, this is what children's books could be. And its intended aim was to inspire publishers actually to publish more good quality books, because it was also a moment in time where there was a lot of kind of quickly produced, low quality, recycled kind of anthology material. And so, you know, librarians were very interested in how do we get more of the good stuff and how do we make it more visible.
So do you think it's like we've talked about the first one, how has that progressed through the years? Have you seen the value, you know, the value of children's literature change because of it, do you think?
Yes, definitely. So that kind of almost heritage building is a real feature of the early medal. And then as you come into the 60s and 70s, which was an incredibly important time for British children's literature, kind of second golden age, a moment where there was lots of social investment in children's books, but also a moment in time where there were lots of people, the so-called kind of educated out people who'd had scholarships, you know, they'd come from working class backgrounds, they'd had scholarships to grammar school, they'd become professionally educated, many became teachers or librarians. And so those were people who had had the experience of getting access to reading and to education, and that had been really transformative to them. And actually, one of those people I should give a little mention to, which is Aidan Chambers, who of course is a former president of the School Library Association and just passed away a few weeks ago. And he really is kind of emblem of that generation of people who really personally felt how much books and reading could mean and could matter, and then went on to work with young people, often young people who, you know, were in situations where they didn't have that access to literature, and they felt really passionate about getting those young people engaged and kind of giving them this gift which they'd had. And that was reflected in a completely different type of book coming onto, you know, the Carnegie list. So we had 1968, Alan Garner's The Owl Service, you know, a really radical piece of literature. It still holds up as radical today, you know, really interesting, really difficult to pin down its genre, but also really concerned with, you know, the travails of being an adolescent working class youth in the 1960s. That's kind of one level of that book. And then later on into the 1970s, we get Robert Westall's The Machine Gunners, you know, which is, again, working class young people, Northern accents, very striking at the time, and a picture of childhood that was much more kind of challenging, that acknowledged that childhood could be, you know, violent, that children could be exposed to difficult circumstances. And that really grew out of that awareness of librarians, that actually young people wanted books that reflected something about their real lives and experiences.
Yeah. So it's interesting, isn't it? Because actually The Machine Gunners is one of the books that was I read, I remember reading at school, maybe it was even GCSE I read it. But it was always those gritty things, and actually I hadn't realized that it had come from the Carnegie. It had won the Carnegie Medal. I wonder if this is not a question I've given you, but I wonder if a lot of the books that we now see in schools that are being read in schools, do you know the statistics for those ones that have been chosen? You probably don't, so I've probably thrown you.
So I don't know the statistics. It would be a great part of the research to do, actually, is to look at curriculums over the time and see. But kind of anecdotally, I know they are certainly books that have stuck around. So they've often stayed in print much longer than other children's books. They often show up in scholarly literature. So, you know, children's literature scholars like myself often choose to write about Carnegie winners, or to kind of say, oh, this person won the Carnegie, as a kind of shorthand for, so they're important enough to study. They show up in school librarians, you know, again, in school libraries. I know that school librarians often will buy the shortlist. You know, as a school librarian, I certainly always had the shortlist every year, although I was fortunate enough to have a generous book purchasing budget, and it's not necessarily as easy to add books that you haven't got an absolute 100% sureness will speak to your particular constituency if you haven't got that budget. Yeah, and they have been on school curricula, and The Machine Gunners is a good example of one that's still on the school curriculum, certainly in the Northeast, because obviously Robert Westall is a big, important Northeast writer.
Yeah. Ruth, can I bring you in?
Yeah, I was interested in the grittiness of it, because you were saying that certainly in the 1970s there was that grittiness and the introduction of northern accents. There's certainly been a very gritty feel to them recently. There are funny books on the list. There have been funny books on the list recently, but funny, gritty, dark, funny. And there's a definite, this year, there's a definite regional voices going on, and there has been in the past, I think. I'm interested to know whether that's no doubt not conscious, but I'm interested to know whether that's generally a thing that has happened over the history of it. Have they been tended to be quite gritty books?
Not always. It's definitely something, again, that's kind of reflected shifting sense of what children's books should be or could be. So, I think we're living through a period in which our sense of the need to think about social issues, to think about social justice in particular, is really acute. And some of the books on this year's shortlist, I found almost too relevant to what was happening, actually. And I think, we've seen in the last several years a really big move, again, a really big kind of return to the idea of books that could be mirrors, of books that reflected the reality of the young people who would read them, in particular, the kind of concern for them to reflect the kind of racial and class diversity of the country. And obviously the Carnegie Medal, was challenged in 2017 for not really reflecting that diversity, and has put in a lot of changes to try and think about how to address, some of the issues that came up in that discussion. And I think that the success of that has really been reflected in the shortlist in the last few years, that we've had, more regional voices than we've had for a while. We've had the first ever Black British winner last year. We've had a kind of bit of a change in complexion, certainly from, when I was shadowing with young people in the early 2000s, that was an era where we were really seeing a lot of historical novels on the shortlists, but also, had very interesting things to say. And lots of those had things to say about, how we think of ourselves as a nation, how we reckon with our own history, that also spoke to kind of what was going on at that moment in time.
I think you get, so I would agree at the moment there's diversity of voice, but what there isn't, it feels to me, is diversity of story type. So I can't remember, apart from last year, the boy in the cave, what's that? The Joseph Coelho book. Can't remember what it's called.
The boy in the maze. The boy lost in the maze. Yeah.
So that's a kind of fantasy, but at the same time, it's really dealing with social issues. I can't remember the last time there was pure fantasy on there.
I'm trying to think the last time Frances Harding was on, because
exactly. Where is Frances Harding?
She's been invisible in the last few years, but you're right.
I know, but and that's what I'm wondering, whether, I mean, it's not enough books to be diverse in every way every year, but I'm wondering whether it goes through those cycles, or whether there have been times at which you feel there's kind of a real balance and diversity of voice, and diversity of reader as well. I think
I think it does go through cycles, as the publishing industry goes through cycles. So, you're always responding to what's out there, what's culturally prominent at the time. Sometimes it's only in retrospect that you can really strongly see the commonalities between texts. So, when I look now at that first 20 years, I see a recurrent concern with heritage and history. But across those books, some of them were would have felt quite different at the time. You know, it's only when you take a step back and you can see that they all have this kind of theme that runs through them. You know, the criteria have been revised quite regularly as well. And so depending on kind of exactly how they're framed, that can push people to think about different kinds of things, although they always steer well clear of genre. And the kind of social concerns of the time. So, you know, we have had this kind of discourse around books as social justice. And I think that tends to make people think more towards social realism, although in fact, fantasy is a great venue for exploring social justice. But yeah, you do get these kind of interesting trends in the shortlists that you see a kind of block of time.
Yeah. So let's move, as much as I could listen to this forever. Let's move on to what role do school librarians and educators play in keeping the history and values of the Carnegie Medal alive in their work with young people. I became aware of the Carnegie and Greenaway because it was something that was already being followed and done when I started work at Guernsey Schools Library Service. It's constantly talked about, obviously around the time that the medals are announced. Do you think that there's something that school librarians and educators have to do to keep that history alive?
I mean, the Carnegie Medal is librarians, and so it only exists through librarians. I suppose the question is really, you know, what does the history matter? Because it can exist as a future-facing thing. And I think one of the things that I'm interested in the research that I'm doing, so it's got a few threads, that the work that I'm doing. Part of it is the history of which books have won, and I'm, you know, looking at these kind of trends of genre and author and theme. Part of it is the kind of wider history of librarians and the kind of debates around the medal, and how it fitted into kind of social movements. And then part of it, and this has been only emerged in the last few years actually, because for a long time I was kind of wary of working as a literary scholar directly with young people. And then I had the opportunity to work with a brilliant colleague at Newcastle University, Jill Clark, whose expertise is in participatory research with young people. And it kind of slotted into place because I'd been kind of thinking there's this history there to be told, and there are all these voices, but there's this big gap, which is the voice of young people and what they think and what it means to them. And so working with Jill, you know, I'm hoping to get funding to do some work directly with young people. And part of what I'm hoping they'll do, because they'll actually design that part of the research themselves, is to help me think about how and whether the historical parts of the medal mean anything to them or not. So that's a little bit of a tangent, I suppose. But for me, thinking about what this research will do for librarians, I think there's something really powerful in being able to take that long view and being able to think about how the medal has kind of constantly reinvented itself and responded to different circumstances, to different amounts of resource in the profession. So, you know, it existed before Youth Libraries Group, before the Association of Children's Librarian, which is what became YLG. And actually, the Association of Children's Librarians partly came into being around the medal and used the medal to promote itself. And I think it's really helpful and inspiring, actually, thinking from my position as a librarian, to be able to see that long history and to perhaps take a step back as well when thinking, you know, for judges, when they're thinking about the work they're doing, to be able to situate it in those kind of broader discourses, to be able to be robust as well. You know, it's a medal, as many literary awards are, that rests on the unpaid devotion of a huge amount of people. And that means that when criticisms are raised of it, that's extremely painful because everybody's working to make it brilliant. And when you're working really hard to make something brilliant and somebody says, yeah, but this bit's really not working, that doesn't feel good. But actually, one of the things that's amazing about it is that it's weathered those criticisms over the years, and it's been able to kind of listen to different perspectives and to reinvent itself and to keep responding to what young people and children's books need at any given moment. And so part of that connection to the history to me is really to be able to think of it as this kind of living organism and to be able to feel how resilient it is, you know, that criticisms come up. And that's good. That's what keeps it alive. That's what keeps it meaningful, even though they don't always feel enjoyable to engage with in the moment.
Yeah. Yeah.
Elizabeth, can't you just feel an inquiry project going on through this?
Absolutely.
And it's like crying out for year 7, year 8, even older possibly, looking into the history, looking at the themes relating, seeing what's going on socially. It's like there's so much there. And apart from the fact that it's just decided me what I'm going to do with my display before the year 5 open evening on Thursday. Thank you very much. I think, you know, that question of what's going on in society and how is it reflected in what was on the Carnegie shortlist, let alone what won that year, is absolutely, I mean, that's got inquiry all over it.
I do think myself that it's really important to think of it historically. Now that I'm talking about it,
Never thought of it before, but now you mention it.
that actually, you know, the people who have taken part in this year's Carnegie Award are part of the history going forward, and it's like they're involved in something huge. And actually, I don't know whether that's always acknowledged, you know, that actually it's we all know it's hugely prestigious, and the winner, it's like an amazing thing to win. And there are so many people involved, but actually, do you know, yeah, the history is so important, Lucy. I'm not surprised you've got so deep into it, because I think it sounds amazing. It sounds fascinating.
Yeah, it really has made the children's canon in many ways. You know, there are books that have won that have dropped out of sight, sometimes because even at the time people didn't really like them. So The Grange at High Force, which was one of the, I think it was 1965, got loads of flack. Aidan Chambers said it was extremely boring. And it's true enough, it's out of print. So people who thought it was a bad winner were vindicated.
Yeah.
And there are books that have dropped out of sight for other reasons. So William Mayne's A Grass Rope, which I think is an amazing book, but William Mayne is a problematic character. And so he's no longer in print, and that's probably right for him to be kind of consigned to no longer being read by children. But yeah, on the whole, the books have survived, continue to survive, and I really hope that will continue. You know, in a way, the most recent part of the project is the hardest part because, of course, you can't know exactly what will survive, and it's much harder to take that step back in your contemporary moment. But I would love to see the books that have won in the last few years in the next 30 years, you know, or 50 years. They're kind of speaking to this moment, and I can imagine that they would do so. Actually, you know, I really enjoyed reading the shortlist this year. Really loved Glasgow Boys, found it really gripping. Also found it really interesting, and I think it does pose it poses a challenge for the Carnegie that's been recurrent for many years and maybe will never be resolved, which is, you know, it's young adult in a very contemporary publishing sense. You know, it's literally got a character who is at university. You know, certainly I know, because I've done some work with my young adult university students, they think of themselves as young adult, and they think of it as a genre for them. And that's a shift from, you know, earlier teenage literature. It makes it harder to encompass the younger readers of the Carnegie Medal, who were, you know, if you think about past winners like Tom's Midnight Garden, that's a perfect, beautiful book for your kind of middle grade 8 to 12s.
But even this year, final year, Matt Goodyear, that's literally by definition a year 6 read.
Yeah.
And eminently readable for year 6, but also, I mean, the most beautiful piece of writing. It was the only book that's ever made me write on LinkedIn about how amazing it was. I mean, just beautiful writing, but completely the other end of the age spectrum. I'm interested that your university students think that they're YA, because so do my school kids. YA is...
it's an elastic...
Very elastic.
But it's also, you know, and this is a different part of my research, but it's very circumstantial. You know, in 1978, you would most people were leaving school at 16. You know, the school leaving age had not long been raised to 16. You know, it only was raised in 1970. Now, you know, my university students, most of them expected to go to university, and that was a kind of predetermined path, in a way that when I was at school, that was A levels. Like most people did A levels. Not everyone I went to school with went to university. Now it's university. So, you know, the end of childhood is stretched longer and longer, and other kind of milestones of being able to buy a house or have a baby or have a secure job feel ever further away. So I think it's not very surprising that young adult has become a very, very long period of time. Is another thing that, like I say, I find it so interesting to be able to look at the medal and see these kind of shifts around, you know, which part of childhood is kind of preoccupying people at that time, how big a part of the population is being reflected in all kinds of different ways. You can really see all of these different factors going on at different times.
So do you think that the historical context of past winners helps students better critique or appreciate modern shortlisted books? Do you think that you could use them in that way, that, you know, getting the students to look at this year's winner as opposed to what was coming out in the 1960s? Do you think that that would help?
Yeah, I think it would. I mean, it can be quite challenging, but there's actually, I've done a little bit of the work with young people, and one of the things that's so rewarding, and that I've kind of forgotten about, actually not having worked in schools for quite some time now, is, you know, how astute and capable young people are actually. And, you know, the young people who I worked with, shout out to Cramlington Learning Village and their shadowing group, really were able very quickly to think about the medal in ways that were just as sophisticated as my postgraduate students who were also working on the medal with me. And one of the things that I found very interesting was how quickly they started to think about it in a kind of bigger frame and in the long view. And when they started to reflect on, you know, how would you choose a book to be the best book? That's not the criteria anymore. It used to be an outstanding book. And, you know, who, for whom, and according to whom. You know, they quite quickly raised questions around, well, what would you need to judge that? You know, could young people judge it themselves? And, you know, they talked about the fact that as an adult, you might have more experience of different kind of reading needs and life experiences, and that might give you a different perspective. And so I haven't done the historical work with them yet, but I actually think that they would engage really well with that cultural context, and it would give them that way of stepping outside the current moment a bit, and then coming back to the current books and thinking, okay, what would it tell me if I was, if I was 20 years in the future, what would this book tell me about now? And does it speak to what I think about now, or does it actually miss something out or get something wrong?
What was so interesting, I think, was when the Carnegie shortlist came out this year, it was the same time that Adolescence was on the television. And in our school, there was a whole, and in lots of schools and in the national press, a whole question about should you watch Adolescence with your children or not? Should they be showing it in schools? And having watched it with my 17-year-old, my feeling was, no, you shouldn't, because actually that's written for adults. And it only makes sense because you empathize with the parents in that show in a way that children are never going to, and therefore you're missing out something. But at the same time, I was also reading Play and Glasgow Boys and the other orange one, Treacle Town, and thinking, this is what, if you want to talk to your kids about these issues, this is what you should be doing. You should be reading these books with your kids, which are designed to be read by kids, and you should be using these to have that conversation. So I said, I made a poster from school and send it out. And I think, it'll be interesting to see whether that is the thing that is reflected from this year's awards, because there are very strong male voices, because final year is a similarly strong male voice. There are actually hardly any female voices. But from that kind of marginalized, or that question of male friendship and male power and that side of it, which is really interesting, I think. I was going to ask Lucy, when did the Shadowers Award come in? That's very recent, isn't it?
It's very recent. It's, let me think,
last 3 or 4 years.
2019.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I'd be interested to see whether in time, how that reflects how the Shadowers' choice, whether those books last or not. Because I have to say, I usually agree with the Shadowers and don't agree with the judges.
Yeah, I love the Shadowers Award. And another great example of how organic actually the medal is, because shadowing was not a top-down institution. It emerged from school librarians thinking about how to engage better, and then was kind of folded in. And then it's really post that diversity review that it was one of the responses to the diversity review to think, well, actually, how do we make sure these books are kind of reflecting the diversity of young people? Well, one way is to just ask them. And I find it interesting. It's quite often gone to the same book as the I don't want to say the main award, because that kind of does, but the parent award. And the winner this year was so interesting to me, because that was a book that for me, I was like, this book isn't for me. Not in the sense that I don't like it, but in the sense that I very much was like, it's not for me. It's
for
King of
Nothing, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, it was brilliant though.
So I enjoyed it, but I also, it was a book that I was like, I really want to talk to young people about this, because I know this is a different book for me than it is for them, in a way that some books are not. Some books you meet in the middle. But that very much felt like, yes, this has got something to say to young people that I don't know about because I'm not a young person. And I was right, because there you go, won the Shadowers Award. So they felt that as well.
It's funny though, so because I haven't read this year's shortlist. I know I'm terrible.
You must.
How can I be having a conversation without
it's doing it? Brilliant as well.
I will get round to it. But in the past, the books that I have read, I think reading them as adults, the content has hit me harder because of my adulthood. Whereas the students, when they're reading something that is extremely traumatic, it just either is just it not quite washes over their heads, but doesn't have the impact that it would have on an adult who has more knowledge and understanding of those events. And I think that that's really interesting that actually these books are written for students. So therefore, what we think is shocking is doesn't have that shocking impact that it does for us. And I think that's what's fascinating about all fiction, isn't it? Is that you bring yourself to it in order to be able to read it. But
Yeah, I was having that conversation with our year 10s today who had rediscovered Goodnight, Mr. Tom. Did that win one year? Must have done.
Not win, no.
Oh, shocking.
it
You
should
know,
have done.
what was better than Goodnight, Mr. Tom?
I can't think what year it would have been, but it didn't win.
Well, they said that they'd read it at primary school and thought at the time it was quite hard hitting because they'd had to ask the teacher what the word emaciated meant, which was an indication that it was quite hard hitting. But she said, I've just started rereading it now and I am horrified at that book. It's horrendous. And I said, I know, I read it as an adult or as a much older. I don't think I read it as, at the age it was written for. And I wept, it was horrendous. And the same with John Boyne's Boy in the Striped Pajamas. That's read by year 4 children. It's so beautifully written that they read that without understanding the full impact of the ending of that book. And yet, which is why you should never watch the film, because it's like America have whacked you over the head with a sledgehammer of the Holocaust. But that's brilliant because you can reread that with that understanding and get a whole different story from it. I mean, it's an incredible ability to do that. Sorry, that's off topic, but it is.
Well, I find that book very problematic. I think if you write a Holocaust novel at the Holocaust Museum, feel the need to issue a comment about there's some thinking to be done. But anyway, it's not a Carnegie winner. I found that another book that I haven't had the chance to discuss with young people but really want to is The Blue Book of Nebo.
Yes.
That, of course, has a child and an adult narrator. But also, it's a book that would be a completely different book to a child. I read it, at a point in time when I had a 2-year-old who I was regularly carrying in a sling. And to read that book, with the child character who dies was just unbearably painful to me. And of course, that's not the part of the book that most speaks to a 14-year-old reader. And I really felt as I read it, like, I want to know what book this is for a child, because I think there's another amazing book, but I don't know what it is. Which is one of the really fascinating things about the Carnegie Medal and any children's award is, all books are many books to many readers, and you can never say what, what is a child. There are many children, there's no singular child, but there is that kind of particular difference of perspective between the child and the adult. And so you kind of have this fascinating task of bringing the knowledge of the adult judges, but also kind of having to think about, well, what would this be to a child reader? And it is very different, particularly in that gritty content. So another person who's never won the Carnegie, although she has been shortlisted, is Jacqueline Wilson. And I regularly teach Jacqueline Wilson, and I always have that conversation with students that they'll read the story of Tracy Beaker and be like, oh my God, I can't believe I read this when I was 8. But it's because, it's a book that absolutely rests on the fact that the child isn't bringing that knowledge and understanding, unless they are, in which case it speaks them in a very different way. But most children read that and it's funny and it's a little bit scary, but it's not the kind of shocking book that it is when you come back as an adult and think, oh my God, I know now what could have happened and where this could have gone.
Yeah.
So actually, this brings us to a really good question, which is what advice would you give to librarians or teachers who want to use the Carnegie Medal as a springboard for deeper engagement with literature and identity? I think we've touched on it a little bit already, but is there more? Is there something else that we are missing that we should be thinking about?
So in some ways, I feel a bit of a fraud answering this question, because although I teach young people, young adults, it's been a long time since I worked in a school, and I feel like I'm teaching my grandmother to suck eggs. I know how many brilliant school librarians there are out there doing brilliant things. I think for me, part of what's powerful about a literary award is that idea of choice and of thinking in a kind of bigger way about, well, how do you choose, and what are the reasons why you might choose a book and say, this is a book that's outstanding or that deserves recognition in some way. And there's a lot of evidence that freedom of choice is really important to literacy and to engaging with literacy. As a child, you have to read an awful lot of stuff that's just forced on you.
Yeah.
And at its worst, obviously, Carnegie shadowing could feel just the same thing. Like, here's some books, you didn't get to choose them. I'm just going to ask you to read them. But I think actually engaging young people with that idea, this is an exercise in choice. People are thinking hard about how to choose it. You too can look at the criteria and think about, how you would apply them, and maybe you would choose different books. So I guess part of the way that if I was to go back, I was 23 when I was a school librarian. And if I was to go back now and give myself some advice of how to deal with my not very able year 7 reading group who were dead keen to read the Carnegie, it would be to have more conversations with them about, okay, like maybe some of these books you're not going to be able to read because they're too demanding, or they're too demanding in content, but are they a way to start thinking about what matters to you and how you would choose? And yeah, so that would be the thing that I would really want to take forward.
Absolutely. And looking forward, how could the Carnegie Medal and its history be used to support inclusive reading cultures and youth voice in literary spaces? Is there a place? Is it going to continue? Should it always be there? What do you reckon?
I hope it's going to continue. I think it's reinvented itself so many times, and it's continuing to do so. Every year I see a kind of reflection and changes. We're not that far off the centenary now, 2036. And one of the things that I'm hoping to do in my research is to kind of be able to contribute to coming up to that centenary with a real deep reflection about what it has meant, but also what it could mean in the future, and how it could best be ready to meet that future, because children's books are so important, and in fact are almost more important with every year that passes. As we think about the world of AI, which is a kind of black box where you can't see how it's coming up with its ideas or where it's coming from or what its biases are. We need to be growing young people who can think critically about how meaning is created and how words are created, and who is choosing things, who is creating things. And to me, literature is the way into those conversations and more kind of deeply human conversations. And so if we're to survive as human beings, then literature needs to survive as well. And that's the thing that I've seen in the Carnegie Medal in the last few years, is the trend that I can see looking over the recent shortlists is that real deep reflection on what do stories mean to us. And lots of writers are coming to that story, to that question in their stories, and allowing their characters to explore what is story? What is storytelling? How do we think about it? How do we use it? So I think it's very ready to meet the future.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Oh, wonderful, Lucy.
I could just go on talking about the Carnegie Medal forever.
We almost need another hour. I will book you in for next year. Thank you so much for joining me today, Lucy and Ruth. And as always, anything we've talked about will be put in the show notes below. We've mentioned quite a few books tonight, so maybe I will try and go back and see if I can list the ones that we've talked about specifically. If you'd like to comment on anything that you've heard today, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to my podcast so you don't miss out on future discussions. Thank you very much for listening.